A karate champion laughs at a disabled veteran in a wheelchair, mocking the old soldier's sacrifice and rolling him around like a toy while his crew films for social media. The arrogant fighter thinks he's found the perfect victim to humiliate a helpless man who can't fight back. But the quiet stranger in the corner booth isn't just another customer sipping coffee. This is Mike Tyson himself. The MMA bully has no idea he just terrorized a Purple Heart recipient in front of a man who's been breaking bones and crushing egos for over 50 years. While the punk continues his cruel taunts, the martial arts legend rises from his seat with that deadly calm that's made grown men weep. The disabled vet recognizes his savior and wheels back, knowing the champion is about to learn why some legends never need to prove themselves. The bully's friends keep recording, thinking they're capturing another viral humiliation, but they're actually filming their leader's complete destruction. What happens when you pick on the wrong veteran in front of the wrong old man? Can the so-called champion survive 12 seconds with a living legend? What happened next would haunt the arrogant fighter for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn silence at exactly 6:30 a.m., same as it had every morning for the past 6 months. Frank Morrison's eyes opened immediately. Old habits from Vietnam died hard, even 45 years later. The familiar weight of dread settled in his chest as reality crashed back down like a boot to the gut. .2 stumps where his legs used to be. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy rotation, remembering when he could spring out of bed and be dressed in under 3 minutes. Now the simple act of getting vertical required a choreographed routine that still felt like admitting defeat. "Morning, my hero." Betty's voice drifted from the kitchen, warm as fresh coffee and twice as necessary for starting his day. Frank transferred from bed to wheelchair with practiced efficiency, his powerful arms doing work his legs once handled. The Purple Heart on his dresser caught the morning light, a reminder of when his body was whole and his purpose clear. These days, he wasn't sure what he was fighting for anymore. The bathroom mirror showed a man he barely recognized. Steel gray hair still maintained its military cut. Brown eyes still held their intensity. But something vital had drained out of him that night 6 months ago when the harvester's hydraulic line burst and 10 tons of machinery came down on his legs like the wrath of God. "Frank, coffee's ready," Betty called, her voice carrying that careful cheerfulness that meant she was worried about him again. That he wheeled into the kitchen where his wife of 45 years stood at the counter, still beautiful in her simple blue dress despite the silver in her hair and the worry lines around her eyes. Worry lines he'd put there with his dark moods and silent suffering. "You don't have to get up this early just for me," Frank said, accepting the steaming mug she placed in his hands. Betty kissed the top of his head, her lips lingering a moment longer than usual. 45 years of marriage, and you still don't understand how this works. I get up because I want to see my husband off to his important morning meeting. It's just coffee with Eddie. It's the most important part of your day, and you know it." She squeezed his shoulder. "That diner is the only place you smile anymore." Frank felt the familiar stab of guilt. Betty deserved better than a broken-down soldier who couldn't even work his own farm anymore. The bank had taken the land, the insurance had covered the medical bills, and what remained was this small house and a disability check that made him feel like charity. "I should be back by lunch," he said, finishing his coffee and wheeling toward the door. Betty followed him onto the porch, morning air crisp with the promise of October. The wheelchair ramp Eddie and the other veterans had built still looked too new, too necessary. "See you at lunch, my hero," Betty said, kissing him goodbye with the same fierce love she'd shown when he left for Southeast Asia decades ago. Frank rolled down the familiar sidewalk toward Main Street, wondering if Eddie's coffee and yesterday's newspaper would be enough to keep the darkness at bay for another day. Eddie's Diner sat on Main Street like a monument to simpler times, its red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor unchanged since 1962. Frank Morrison wheeled through the familiar door at exactly 7:15 a.m., greeted by the comforting aroma of bacon grease and strong coffee that had absorbed into the walls over 6 decades. "Morning, Frank." Eddie Kowalski's gravelly voice carried across the diner as he automatically poured black coffee into a heavy ceramic mug. At 67, Eddie still moved with surprising grace behind the counter. His slight limp from an old Vietnam wound barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. The morning regulars occupied their usual spots, Harold Peterson reading the farming report, Martha Williamson working the crossword puzzle, and Dale Crawford discussing weather patterns with anyone who'd listen. They'd learned to treat Frank with casual respect rather than the suffocating pity he'd endured those first few weeks after the accident. Usual spots waiting, Eddie said, nodding toward Frank's table by the window. Frank maneuvered his wheelchair into position, accepting the coffee with hands that had grown strong from 6 months of propelling himself through a world built for walking men. Through the window, Main Street looked exactly as it had when he was a boy, tree-lined and peaceful, the kind of place where people still knew their neighbors' names. In the back corner booth, an older man sat alone with his newspaper and coffee. Baseball cap pulled low over silver hair, flannel shirt neat but worn, work boots that had seen honest labor. Just another early riser starting his day quietly, the kind of customer Eddie had served thousands of times over the decades. The stranger turned a page with weathered hands, and Frank caught a glimpse of intense blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Something familiar about the man's bearing, the straight posture, the controlled movements, the way he held himself ready even while relaxed. Military, Frank would have bet his Purple Heart on it. Any word on the Henderson farm? Frank asked. Eddie, forcing himself to focus on conversation instead of brooding. Bank's taking bids next week, Eddie replied, refilling Frank's cup without being asked. Shame to see another family place go under. Frank nodded, remembering when half the county had been Henderson land. Progress, they called it, though it felt more like slow-motion surrender. The same forces that had taken his own farm after the accident, medical bills, insurance hassles, and the simple inability to work the land from a wheelchair, the peaceful morning rhythm shattered as a bright red Lamborghini roared into the parking lot, its engine note aggressive and demanding in the quiet street. The car's stereo thumped with bass that rattled the diner's windows, drawing disapproving looks from every patron over 50. Frank watched through the window as 3 young men climbed out of the expensive sports car. The driver was built like a prizefighter, covered in tattoos that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Designer athletic wear, gold chains, the kind of swagger that announced its own importance. In the corner booth, the older man with the baseball cap lowered his newspaper slightly, blue eyes focusing on the parking lot with sudden intensity. Tyler Jackson burst through the diner door like he owned the place, phone pressed to his ear and voice loud enough to wake the dead. At 28, he moved with the coiled arrogance of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't punch his way through. Yeah, I'm in this podunk town for one night, Tyler barked into his phone, ignoring the startled looks from the morning crowd. Tell me again why I'm wasting my time in nowhere. Nebraska? His 2 companions followed like faithful dogs, smaller men who'd hitched their wagons to Tyler's rising star and learned to laugh at his jokes whether they were funny or not. Designer tracksuits and expensive sneakers looked absurdly out of place in Eddie's humble diner. Excuse me. Carol the waitress approached nervously, coffee pot in hand. Would you like a table? Tyler barely glanced at her. Yeah, give me the best booth you got. And make sure the coffee's fresh. I don't drink. Day old swill. Carol's face flushed, but she led them to a booth near the center of the dining room. Harold Peterson folded his farming report with obvious irritation, while Martha Williamson's crossword puzzle remained forgotten as she stared at the spectacle. This menu's a joke, Tyler announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. What kind of place doesn't have a protein smoothie or at least some organic options? You people actually eat this processed garbage. Eddie's jaw tightened behind the counter, his weathered hands gripping a coffee mug hard enough to crack porcelain. 40 years of serving his community, and this punk walks in acting like the place was beneath his notice. Frank watched the scene unfold with growing distaste. He'd seen Tyler's type before. Young men who mistook volume for authority and believed their success gave them license to treat others like servants. The kind who'd never learned that respect was earned, not purchased. In the corner booth, the older man had stopped pretending to read his newspaper entirely. His attention fixed on Tyler with the focused intensity of a predator watching potential prey. And another thing. Tyler continued his phone conversation while his friends recorded him with their devices. Make sure the press knows I'm doing charity work in these forgotten towns. The MMA community needs to see me giving back to the little people. The phrase, little people, hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Every patron in the diner had heard it, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. That's when Tyler's roving gaze landed on Frank Morrison. The young fighter's eyes lit up with cruel amusement as he took in the wheelchair, the veteran's cap, the quiet dignity of a man who'd served his country and paid a price for it. Tyler whispered something to his companions that made them snicker, then raised his voice to stage whisper across the diner. "Check out Captain America over there," Tyler said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Looks like somebody's seen better days." The diner fell silent except for the gentle hiss of the coffee maker and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused halfway to waiting mouths. Frank felt 30 pairs of eyes on him, some sympathetic, others curious about how he'd respond to such calculated cruelty. Frank Morrison had faced enemy fire in Vietnamese jungles and death on his own farm, but somehow this moment felt more dangerous than either. Not because of physical threat, but because his response would define him in front of his community. Would he remain the broken man he'd become, or remember the soldier he'd once been? Tyler Jackson's comment sliced through the diner's morning, piece like a blade through silk. Frank Morrison felt every eye in the place settle on him, the weight of expectation and sympathy combining into something almost unbearable. His coffee cup trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the effort required to control 45 years of military discipline. "I'm sorry about him," Carol whispered as she refilled Frank's cup, her face flushed with embarrassment. For her unwelcome customers, Frank managed a tight smile. "Not your fault, sweetheart." Tyler's stage whisper carried perfectly across the silent diner. "I mean, what kind of soldier ends up like that? Must not have been much of a warrior to begin with." Dale Crawford started to rise from his booth, face red with anger, but Frank caught his eye and shook his head slightly. No point in dragging good people into ugliness they didn't deserve. "You know what I'm curious about?" Tyler continued, his voice getting louder as he warmed to his cruel performance. "I bet he got those wheels from the VA, right? My tax dollars probably paid for that ride." He laughed at his own joke while his companions recorded every word. Eddie Kowalski came around the counter like a storm front, dish towel clutched in his fists. "That's enough, son. Show some respect or find another place to eat." Tyler looked up at the graying veteran with amused contempt. "Relax, Pops. I'm just making conversation. No law against asking questions, is there?" "There's a law against being a decent human being," Eddie shot back, "but apparently nobody explained it to you." "Easy there, tough guy." Tyler stood up, using his full 6'2" frame to loom over Eddie. "You want to be careful how you talk to paying customers. This isn't the 1950s anymore. You can't just throw people out because you don't like what they say." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Frank could see Eddie's hands shaking, not with fear, but with the same barely controlled rage that had gotten them both through firefights in Southeast Asia. In the corner booth, the older man had folded his newspaper with precise movements, blue eyes now locked on the confrontation with laser focus. Frank made his decision. He wheeled his chair back from the table and turned to face Tyler directly, his voice calm and steady despite the fury burning in his chest. "You're right about one thing," Frank said quietly. "The VA did help pay for this wheelchair. Same way they helped pay for my Purple Heart and the Medal of Valor I earned dragging 3 wounded Marines out of a killing field while Charlie tried to turn us all into hamburger." The diner was so quiet you could hear dust settling. "I lost these legs in a farming accident 6 months ago," Frank continued, his brown eyes never leaving Tyler's face. "Before that, I worked this land for 40 years, raised crops that fed families like yours, paid taxes that funded the roads you drive on, and the schools that obviously failed to teach you basic manners." Tyler's smirk faltered slightly, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "Sounds like a bunch of ancient history to me, old man. What have you done lately?" That's when Tyler made his fatal mistake. He stepped closer to Frank's wheelchair, invading the veteran's personal space with calculated intimidation. His voice dropped to a cruel whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent diner. I bet you wish you could stand up for yourself, don't you, soldier boy? Must be eating you alive, sitting there helpless while a real man calls you out. The words hit Frank like physical blows, each syllable designed to strip away what remained of his dignity. This wasn't just bullying. It was surgical cruelty, perfectly calculated to destroy a man's spirit in front of his community. But before Frank could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through butter, quiet, controlled, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Son, I think you'd rather pick on someone who can still walk. Tyler Jackson leaned down until his face was inches from Frank Morrison's, close enough that Frank could smell the expensive cologne and protein powder on his breath. The young fighter's phone-wielding companions moved closer, sensing their leader was about to deliver the knockout blow to an already beaten man. "Come on, soldier boy," Tyler whispered, his voice carrying just enough volume for the entire diner to hear every calculated syllable. "Show me what a real warrior can do. Stand up and fight me like a man." Frank's hands gripped his wheelchair armrests with white-knuckled intensity, but his voice remained steady as granite. "Real strength isn't about standing up, son. It's about standing for something. You wouldn't understand that. Standing for something." Tyler laughed, the sound harsh as breaking glass. "Like standing for handouts from Uncle Sam? Standing in line at the welfare office? Standing around feeling sorry for yourself?" He placed one manicured hand on Frank's wheelchair and gave it a deliberate shove, rolling the veteran back 6 inches. The action was small but devastating, a physical violation that stripped away Frank's control over his own movement. The diner's collective intake of breath was audible. Martha Williamson covered her mouth with both hands, while Harold Peterson's newspaper crumpled in his fists. Eddie Kowalski took 2 steps forward before stopping himself, knowing that intervention might only make things worse. But Frank Morrison had faced worse than Tyler Jackson in Vietnamese jungles and American hospitals. His spine straightened with military precision, and something long dormant flickered to life behind his brown eyes. The same steel that had earned him a Purple Heart and the respect of every man who'd served beside him. "You want to know what real strength looks like?" Frank asked quietly. "It's getting up every morning when your body's broken and your spirit's crushed. It's serving your country knowing you might not come home. It's loving your wife for 45 years through good times and bad. It's helping other veterans find their way when they've lost everything that defined them." Tyler rolled his eyes. Theatrically, "Spare me the Hallmark card philosophy, Grandpa. The world belongs to the strong now, not the broken." He grabbed Frank's wheelchair again, this time jerking it sideways hard enough to spill coffee across the table. Frank's hands shot out to steady himself, and for one horrible moment, it looked like he might tip over entirely. That's when the quiet voice from the corner booth cut through the ugliness like a sword through silk. Calm, controlled, and carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "Son, I think you'd rather pick on someone who can still walk." Every head in the diner turned toward the back corner, where the older man in the baseball cap was rising slowly from his booth. He moved with fluid grace despite his years, and when he removed his cap, silver hair caught the morning light like polished steel. The transformation in the room was immediate and electric, as recognition dawned on face after face. The whispers started as scattered murmurs, but quickly built to an excited buzz that filled Eddie's diner like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Is that? No way. It can't be. Oh my God, it's really him." Chuck Norris stood in the morning light streaming through the front window, 84 years old, but still carrying himself with the quiet confidence that had made him a legend. Silver hair, weathered face, those unmistakable blue eyes that had stared down countless villains on movie screens and proven themselves just as formidable in real life. Tyler Jackson's swagger faltered for the first time all morning. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. "You've got to be kidding me. The fossil from all those ancient movies." But his bravado rang hollow now, especially as his own phone recording companions lowered their devices and stared at the approaching legend with obvious awe. One of them whispered, "Dude, that's actually Chuck Norris. Like, the real Chuck Norris." "I don't care if it's John Wayne's ghost," Tyler snapped, though his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "This is between me and Captain Wheelchair here." Chuck approached with measured steps, hands relaxed at his sides, but ready for anything. Every person in the diner watched in fascination as a living legend crossed the black and white checkered floor with the fluid movement of a natural predator. "Young man," Chuck said politely, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd never needed to raise it to command respect, "I'd appreciate it if you'd step away from the veteran." The simple request hung in the air like a challenge. Tyler glanced around the diner, taking in the expectant faces, the phone cameras that were now pointed at him instead of Frank, the sudden shift in power dynamics that had caught him completely off guard. His ego wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of his crew, not in front of all these small-town nobodies, and certainly not in front of whatever cameras were now recording every word. Tyler Jackson had built his entire brand on never backing down from anyone, and an 84-year-old movie star wasn't going to change that. "You know what, old man?" Tyler stepped away from Frank's wheelchair and turned to face Chuck directly. "Maybe it's time someone taught you that this isn't the 1980s anymore. Your 15 minutes ended a long time ago." Chuck's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardening that suggested Tyler had just made a very poor decision. "I suppose we'll find out about that." Eddie Kowalski was already moving, pushing tables and chairs aside. With practiced efficiency, other patrons pressed back against the walls, giving the two men space while ensuring they had perfect views of what was about to unfold. Frank Morrison wheeled himself back slightly, recognition and amazement warring across his weathered features. He'd grown up watching Chuck Norris movies, had seen every episode of Walker, Texas Ranger, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of witnessing the legend in person. The cleared space in the center of Eddie's diner suddenly felt like an arena, with Tyler bouncing on his feet like a caged animal and Chuck standing perfectly still, waiting with the infinite patience of someone who'd done this dance many times before. Tyler Jackson bounced on the balls of his feet in the cleared space, shadowboxing and rolling his shoulders like a prizefighter preparing for the championship bout of his life. At 28, with 200 pounds of muscle and a professional fighting record that had made him famous, he radiated the dangerous confidence of youth and strength. "I hope you've got good insurance, Grandpa," Tyler taunted, throwing combination punches at the air, "because I'm about to show everyone why the old generation needs to step aside for the new." Chuck Norris stood motionless in the morning light, hands at his sides, breathing slow and controlled. If Tyler was a raging fire, Chuck was deep water, calm on the surface but hiding currents that could drag down the unwary. His blue eyes tracked every movement without seeming to watch at all. The diner held its collective breath. Martha Williamson gripped Harold Peterson's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. Eddie wiped his hands on his dish towel over and over, a nervous habit left over from Vietnam. Frank Morrison watched with the professional interest of a man who'd seen combat and recognized the difference between flash and substance. But Tyler's phone recording friends had their devices out again, thinking they were about to capture their leader's greatest triumph. The moment he defeated a living legend and proved that youth conquered age, strength defeated experience. And the new world had no place for old heroes. They had no idea they were about to record something entirely different. Tyler charged forward with a wild haymaker, putting every ounce of his considerable strength behind a punch designed to end the fight in spectacular fashion. His form was perfect by MMA standards, weight shifting properly, hip rotation generating maximum power, fist aimed precisely at Chuck's jaw. Chuck Norris moved like water flowing around a rock. The sidestep was so effortless it seemed like Tyler had simply thrown his punch at empty air. But Chuck wasn't just avoiding the attack. He was redirecting it, using Tyler's own momentum against him with the kind of precision that came from 50 years of perfecting the art of combat. Tyler's forward rush became a controlled fall as Chuck guided him past, then smoothly stepped behind him. Before the younger man could recover his balance, Chuck's arm slipped around his throat in a textbook rear naked chokehold. The hold was flawless, tight enough to cut off blood flow to Tyler's brain without damaging his throat, positioned perfectly to prevent escape, applied with the clinical precision of a master craftsman demonstrating his art. Tyler struggled desperately, his powerful frame thrashing like a caught fish, but he might as well have been fighting the tide. Chuck's technique was perfect, his leverage absolute, his control complete. 12 seconds. That's how long it took for Tyler Jackson's face to redden, his struggles to weaken, and his hand to frantically tap Chuck's forearm in the universal signal of submission. Chuck released him immediately, helping the gasping fighter to his feet with the same gentle care he'd shown in approaching Frank's wheelchair. Tyler stood swaying, one hand massaging his throat, staring at Chuck with the dazed expression of a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered. The diner's wall clock showed exactly 12 seconds had passed since Tyler threw his first punch. Tyler Jackson slumped in a chair that Eddie had quickly provided, still catching his breath and massaging his throat where Chuck's arm had applied its perfect, terrible pressure. His face was pale beneath his tan, and his hands trembled slightly, not from injury, but from the complete demolition of everything he believed about himself. His phone recording companions stood frozen, devices still capturing their leader's humiliation in high definition. What was supposed to be Tyler's triumphant bullying of a disabled veteran had become the most embarrassing 12 seconds of his professional life, and it was all on video. Chuck settled into the chair across from Tyler, his movements unhurried and graceful. Frank Morrison wheeled closer, drawn by curiosity about what would happen next. The rest of the diner remained pressed against the walls, afraid to break the spell of this unprecedented moment. "You've got good technique," Chuck said quietly, his voice holding no mockery or triumph. "Solid fundamentals, decent conditioning. But you've been fighting the wrong battles, son." Tyler looked up with eyes that held none of their earlier arrogance. "I don't understand. You're not here by accident," Chuck continued, his blue eyes studying Tyler's face with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades reading people's intentions. "This whole performance, the cruel taunts, the physical intimidation, making sure your friends recorded everything. This wasn't random bullying. This was professional." Frank's hands tightened on his wheelchair armrests as understanding began to dawn. "What are you saying?" Chuck never took his eyes off Tyler. "I'm saying someone paid him to be here. Someone who wanted this veteran humiliated on camera. Someone who benefits when heroes like Frank Morrison look weak and helpless." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Tyler's face crumbled completely, the last of his bravado collapsing under the weight of truth and shame. $50,000, Tyler whispered, the confession spilling out like poison from an infected wound. "He paid me $50,000 to come here and create incidents. Make veterans look unstable, dangerous, pathetic. Give the city council justification for what they wanted to do anyway." Frank's face went white, then red with rage. Who? Who paid you?" "City Councilman Roger Hayes." Tyler couldn't meet Frank's eyes. "He said the Riverside Veterans Center was sitting on prime real estate, worth millions to developers. But they needed public support to shut it down, needed people to believe veterans were problems instead of heroes." The pieces clicked together in Frank's mind like bullets sliding into a magazine. The center where he'd spent the last decade helping fellow veterans transition to civilian life, where men and women who'd served their country found community and purpose and hope. It was all under attack, and he'd been too wrapped up in his own problems to see it coming. Chuck's eyes had gone cold as winter steel. How many other towns? How many other veterans? Tyler shook his head miserably. This was supposed to be the last one. Hayes promised if I delivered one more viral video of a veteran breakdown, the city council would vote to close the center next week. The demolition is already scheduled. Frank Morrison stared at the young man who'd nearly destroyed him, understanding finally that this had never been about one bully's cruelty. This was about systematic corruption, about people in power deciding that those who'd served their country were expendable obstacles to profit. The morning crowd had dispersed after the confrontation, leaving Eddie's diner unusually quiet for 10 o'clock on a weekday. Chuck Norris, Frank Morrison, and Eddie Kowalski sat around Frank's usual table, while Tyler Jackson slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon, his two companions hovering nervously near the door. "Start from the beginning," Chuck said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made Tyler confess in the first place. "How did Hayes approach you?" Tyler stared at his hands, shame radiating from him like heat from a fever. 3 months ago, after my fight in Lincoln, Hayes said he'd seen my social media presence, knew I could generate viral content, offered me 50 grand to visit small towns and create incidents with local veterans. Frank's jaw worked silently, fury building behind his brown eyes. "What kind of incidents?" confrontations that made veterans look unstable, dangerous, out of control. Hayes said the footage would help justify closing veteran facilities that were draining tax dollars. Tyler's voice cracked. He made it sound like I was doing a public service, weeding out the weak ones who couldn't hack civilian life. Eddie slammed his coffee mug down hard enough to crack the saucer. You little bastard. Do you have any idea what these men went through? What they sacrificed? I know that now, Tyler whispered. But Hayes showed me statistics, made arguments about fiscal responsibility and public safety. Said most of these guys were damaged goods anyway, better off in private facilities where they couldn't hurt anyone. Chuck's eyes had gone cold as Arctic ice. How many towns? How many veterans did you target? 12 towns over 3 months. Always the same pattern. Find the most vulnerable veteran, humiliate them publicly, make sure it got recorded and shared. Online. Hayes said each incident built public support for closing veteran facilities. Frank leaned forward in his wheelchair, his voice deadly quiet. Tell me about the Riverside Veterans Center. Tyler swallowed hard. Hayes said it's sitting on prime riverfront property worth millions. Some development company wants to build luxury condos and a shopping complex. But the center has a long-term lease and community support, so they needed public opinion to turn against it. And my humiliation was supposed to be the final nail in the coffin, Frank said, understanding. Flooding his features. The city council meets Friday night. Hayes promised if I delivered one viral video of the center's most respected board member looking pathetic and helpless, they'd vote to close it immediately. Demolition crews are already on standby. Chuck studied Tyler's face with the intensity of a prosecutor examining evidence. What else? What aren't you telling us? Tyler's shoulders sagged with defeat. Hayes said if the video didn't go viral enough, if public outrage wasn't strong enough to justify immediate closure, he had backup plans. More aggressive methods to prove veterans were dangerous. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, and Frank Morrison realized that everything he'd worked to build, the sanctuary where broken warriors found healing and purpose, was about to be destroyed by greed and corruption. Frank Morrison's wheelchair-accessible van pulled into the parking lot of the Riverside Veterans Center, with Chuck Norris following in his rented pickup truck. The converted warehouse sat on prime riverfront property, its brick walls and large windows overlooking the slow-moving water that gave the town its name. Built this place from nothing, Frank said as Chuck joined him at the entrance. Started with 12 veterans meeting in Eddie's back room, grew into something that serves the whole county. The automatic doors opened onto a bustling lobby where veterans of all ages gathered around tables, some playing cards, others just talking. Chuck noticed the careful accommodations, wheelchair ramps, wide doorways, grab bars positioned at regulation height. Someone had thought through every detail. Frank, a one-armed man in his 40s, approached with a genuine smile. Good to see you, brother. Heard there was some excitement at Eddie's this morning. Rick Santos, Chuck Norris. Frank made the introduction. Rick did 3 tours in Iraq before an IED took his left arm. Now he runs our job placement program. Rick's remaining hand was firm and calloused. Pleasure to meet you, sir. Frank's told us stories about your movies getting him through some rough nights in the hospital. Chuck followed Frank through the facility, impressed by what he saw. A counseling wing where veterans worked through trauma with trained therapists. Computer labs where older vets learned new skills. A food pantry stocked with donations from local businesses. Workshop spaces where men and women found purpose in woodworking, mechanics, and crafts they could sell at local markets. Marie Collins. Frank introduced a blind woman in her 30s who was teaching a computer class. Lost her sight to an IED in Afghanistan, but she's got a master's degree in information technology. Marie's handshake was confident despite her unseeing eyes. Frank talks about you like your family, Mr. Norris. This place means everything. To people like us, somewhere we belong, where we can still contribute. In the main gathering room, Chuck met Tommy Burke, a Desert Storm veteran whose wheelchair matched Frank's, and a dozen other men and women whose service records read like a catalog of American military history. Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq. Every conflict of the past 50 years was represented. 237 active members, Frank explained as they toured the job training workshops. Some come daily, others just when they need support. We've helped place 86 veterans in meaningful employment over the past 5 years. Chuck studied the facility with a tactical eye, noting security weaknesses and sight lines. The building was solid but exposed, with multiple entrances and large windows that would be difficult to defend. If Hayes wanted to stage an incident here, he'd have plenty of opportunities. What's the legal status? Chuck asked as they returned to the lobby. 20-year lease with the city, renewable in 10-year increments. We've put $400,000 of improvements into the building, all with proper permits and inspections. Frank's voice hardened. But if Hayes can manufacture enough public opposition, claiming we're a danger to the community, the city council can invoke emergency powers to terminate the lease immediately. Chuck's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then showed Frank the screen. It was from Tyler Jackson. Hayes scheduled emergency city council meeting for tomorrow night. Vote to close center already drafted. Says he has new evidence of veteran instability that will guarantee closure. Chuck and Frank separated at the Veterans Center, each taking on different aspects of their investigation. Chuck drove to the county courthouse to research Hayes' background, while Frank made phone calls to rally support from the veteran community and their families. 3 hours later, they reunited at Eddie's diner as the lunch crowd was thinning out. Eddie poured coffee without being asked, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that his friend's life work was under attack. "What did you find?" Frank asked as Chuck settled into the booth across from him. Chuck pulled out a small notebook filled with his precise handwriting. Roger Hayes, 52 years old, city councilman for 8 years. Started clean, but his finances show some interesting patterns over the past 2 years. Gambling debts. Worse, he owes $200,000 to some very unpleasant people connected to organized crime out of Kansas City. Been skimming from city construction contracts to pay interest, but he's behind on payments and running out of time. Eddie leaned against their table, dish towel forgotten in his hands. So he needs money fast, and selling your center's land to developers would solve his problems. Exactly. I traced the development company, Shell Corporation, registered in Delaware, but the real money comes from a syndicate that specializes in acquiring public properties through political pressure. Chuck's eyes were cold. They've done this in 6 other states, always the same pattern. Create public opposition to a facility, get it closed through emergency powers, then buy the land for pennies on the dollar. Frank's phone buzzed with responses to his earlier calls. His face darkened as he read the messages. Half the veterans are afraid to get involved, don't want to make things worse. The other half are ready to fight, but don't know how to take on City Hall. What about community support? Mixed. Some people genuinely support us, but Hayes has been building opposition for months. Planted stories in the local paper about property taxes, public safety concerns, whether veterans are getting too many benefits. Frank's voice was bitter. Amazing how fast people turn when they think their wallets are threatened. Chuck studied his notebook again. Hayes is smart, methodical. He's been working this angle for over a year, setting up all the pieces. The Tyler Jackson incident was supposed to be his grand finale, the viral video that would give him political cover to close you down. Eddie poured himself coffee and joined them at the table. So what's our next move? Can't exactly march into City Hall and accuse a councilman of corruption without proof. We need evidence, Chuck said. Real evidence, not just Tyler's testimony. Hayes is meeting with the developers tonight to finalize the demolition schedule. Frank's hands tightened on his coffee mug. How do you know that? Chuck smiled grimly. Because Tyler's been more helpful than he knows. Hayes thinks he's won, so he's getting careless. Big meeting tonight at 8 o'clock in Hayes' City Hall office to celebrate and divide up the profits. You want to bug his office? Frank asked, recognition dawning on his weathered features. Got any experience with surveillance equipment, Sergeant? Frank's spine straightened with old military pride. 20 years in Special Forces, sir. Reconnaissance was my specialty before I started training others. His eyes lit up with something that had been missing for months. Purpose. Think I remember a trick or two about gathering intelligence on the enemy. Eddie grinned for the first time all day. Sounds like Hayes picked the wrong veteran to mess with. Frank Morrison's garage had been converted into a workshop after his farming accident. The workbenches lowered to wheelchair height and tools organized within easy reach. Chuck examined the surveillance equipment Frank had pulled from military surplus boxes. outdated by current standards, but still functional. For their purposes. Haven't used this stuff since Desert Storm, Frank admitted, his hands moving with surprising confidence as he tested connections on a parabolic microphone. But some skills you never forget. Chuck watched Frank work, noting how the veteran's entire demeanor had changed. The depression and self-doubt that had weighed him down for months was burning away, replaced by the focused intensity of a professional soldier preparing for a mission. Voice-activated recorder goes here, Frank. Positioned a device no bigger than a matchbox. Magnetic mount will stick to the metal window frame outside Hayes' office. Range is about 50 yards, battery life 8 hours. Security cameras in the building. Old system, probably hasn't been updated since the 1990s. Blind spots on the north side where the fire escape is located. Frank's tactical mind was fully engaged now, planning approach routes and escape strategies with the thoroughness that had kept him alive in Vietnam. Chuck helped Frank load additional equipment into a canvas bag, backup recording devices, lock picks, a small camera for photographing documents. You realize we're technically breaking the law here. Frank looked up from his wheelchair, brown eyes steady and determined. Hayes broke the law when he decided to destroy everything I've worked to build. Sometimes you have to choose between what's legal and what's right. They worked in comfortable silence for an hour, Frank's military training complementing Chuck's decades of tactical experience. Despite the 40-year age difference and Frank's physical limitations, they moved together like a well-oiled team. There's something else, Frank said as they finished preparations. Hayes has been talking about backup plans if the council vote doesn't go his way. More aggressive methods to prove veterans are dangerous. Chuck's hands stilled on the equipment bag. What kind of methods? Tyler mentioned Hayes has other contractors, professionals who won't hesitate to stage actual violence if necessary. Men who'll hurt people to create the incidents Hayes needs. The implications were chilling. If political manipulation failed, Hayes was prepared to escalate to genuine violence, putting innocent veterans and their families at risk to protect his corruption scheme. All the more reason to end this tonight, Chuck said grimly. Frank transferred from his wheelchair to the passenger seat of Chuck's pickup truck with practiced efficiency, folding his chair and stowing it in the truck bed. As they drove toward City Hall through the gathering dusk, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since before his accident. The sharp focus and clear purpose of a soldier preparing for combat. Remember, Chuck said as they parked across the street from the municipal building, we're just gathering information. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Frank checked the surveillance equipment one final time, then looked at his new partner with the ghost of a smile. Don't worry about me, sir. I may be missing some parts, but I still remember how to complete a mission. As darkness fell over the quiet town, two warriors prepared to take the fight to an enemy who had seriously underestimated what he was up against. Chuck Norris and Frank Morrison sat in Chuck's pickup truck across the street from City Hall, watching Hayes' black Mercedes pull into the parking lot at exactly 8 o'clock. Two other expensive cars followed, a silver Cadillac and a dark blue BMW, their occupants moving with the confident swagger of men accustomed to buying whatever they wanted. That's Marcus Cole getting out of the Cadillac, Frank whispered, adjusting the parabolic microphone they'd positioned near Hayes' office window an hour earlier. He's the one who's been sniffing around riverfront properties for the past year. The third man was younger, maybe 40, with the predatory smile of someone who enjoyed the process of acquisition as much as the profits. Through their surveillance equipment, they could hear muffled voices as the three men entered Hayes' office on the second floor. Frank fine-tuned the recording equipment, his hands steady despite the stakes. The military surplus gear crackled to life, and suddenly Hayes' voice came through their headphones with crystal clarity. Gentlemen, I think we can safely say our little veteran problem is about to be solved permanently. Chuck and Frank exchanged glances as Hayes continued, his voice full of satisfied malice. The Jackson incident this morning was perfect, exactly the kind of footage we needed to show how unstable these so-called heroes really are. Cole's voice was smooth as silk. The demolition crews are ready to move first thing Monday morning. My people have already surveyed the property and drawn up development plans. We're looking at 40 luxury condos and a high-end shopping complex, conservative estimate of $15 million in profits. Frank's hands clenched into fists as he listened to them casually discuss destroying everything he'd worked to build. The Veterans Center wasn't just a building to these men. It was an obstacle to be removed, its occupants nothing more than inconvenient problems to be solved. What about public opposition? The younger man asked. Some of these old-timers still have friends in the community. Hayes laughed, the sound carrying clearly through their surveillance equipment. After tomorrow night's city council meeting, public opinion won't matter. I've got testimony lined up from concerned citizens, safety reports from building inspectors I own, and enough manufactured evidence to convince a jury that the Veterans Center is a clear and present danger to public safety. The Emergency Powers Clause in the Municipal Code gives us complete authority to terminate their lease immediately, Cole added. No appeals, no delays, no legal challenges. By Monday afternoon, it'll be a pile of rubble. Frank fought to control, his breathing as rage built in his chest like steam in a boiler. These men weren't just corrupt. They were evil, willing to destroy the lives of people who'd served their country just to line their own pockets. That's when Hayes dropped his bombshell. And if the council vote doesn't generate enough public support, I've got backup contractors ready to stage a more convincing incident at the center itself. Real violence this time, with actual casualties if necessary. The next morning's news hit Frank Morrison like a physical blow. Chuck had picked him up early for coffee at Eddie's Diner, but instead of their usual quiet breakfast, they found the television blaring and every patron staring at the screen in horror. Breaking news from downtown, the reporter announced over. Footage of Murphy's bar, its windows smashed and police cars surrounding the building. 3 men identified as military veterans were arrested last night after a violent altercation that sent 2 civilians to the hospital with serious injuries. Frank's coffee cup trembled in his hands as the camera panned across the destruction, overturned tables, broken bottles. $10,000 in damage that looked like a war zone. The reporter continued with barely concealed editorial commentary about troubled veterans and post-traumatic stress episodes. The suspects, all claiming to be members of the Riverside Veterans Center, became violent after being asked to quiet down during what witnesses describe as heavy drinking and aggressive behavior. The reporter said, her tone suggesting the story was already decided. Eddie Kowalski emerged from behind the counter, his face pale with shock. Those aren't our guys, Frank. I know every veteran in this county, and none of them were at Murphy's last night. Chuck studied the television footage with professional interest, noting details the reporter glossed over. Look at their clothing, military. Surplus gear that's too clean, too new. Real veterans don't dress like Halloween costumes. But the damage was already done. Frank's phone buzzed with text messages from community members, some expressing concern, others demanding answers. Social media was exploding with hashtags like #VeteranViolence and #CloseTheCenter. Exactly the kind of manufactured outrage Hayes needed. Channel 7 has obtained exclusive footage of the incident, the reporter announced, and suddenly the screen filled with shaky cell phone video of 3 men in military clothing throwing punches and shouting threats. The audio was conveniently clear enough to capture every profanity and threat, painting veterans as dangerous, unstable predators. Frank recognized none of the men, but he knew who was behind the performance. Hayes' backup contractors, professional criminals dressed up to look like troubled veterans, creating the exact narrative Hayes needed to justify closing the center. The Riverside Veterans Center, where all 3 suspects were reportedly receiving counseling services, has faced increased scrutiny in recent months over concerns about inadequate supervision and treatment of potentially dangerous individuals. The reporter continued, reading what was obviously prepared copy. The phone at Eddie's counter rang constantly. Reporters wanting statements, community members demanding explanations, city officials expressing grave concerns about public safety. Frank watched his life's work crumble in real time. Destroyed by lies and manipulation, he was powerless to stop. Chuck placed a steady hand on Frank's shoulder. This is exactly what Hayes planned. He's orchestrating public opinion, building justification for tonight's council meeting. It's working, Frank said bitterly, reading the flood of angry messages on his phone. Half the town thinks we're harboring dangerous criminals. The other half is afraid to be seen supporting us. By noon, picketers had gathered outside the Veterans Center with signs reading, "Protect our community," and "Veterans need real help, not enablement." The local newspaper's online edition featured an editorial calling for immediate action to address the veteran violence epidemic. Frank Morrison stared at the television screen, watching everything he'd built being systematically destroyed by corruption and lies, and wondered if there was any way to fight back against such calculated evil. The emergency city council meeting that evening packed the municipal auditorium beyond capacity, with concerned citizens filling every seat and lining the walls. Chuck and Frank entered through the back doors, Chuck keeping his baseball cap low while Frank tried to maintain his dignity despite the hostile stares that followed his wheelchair. Roger Hayes had orchestrated the evening perfectly, stacking the audience with supporters while genuine veteran advocates found themselves outnumbered and shouted down. The mood in the room was ugly, fearful, exactly what Hayes needed to justify the predetermined outcome. "Order, order," Mayor Patricia Hoffman called, banging her gavel as Hayes took his position at the council table. "We're here tonight to address the urgent public safety concerns that have arisen regarding the Riverside Veterans Center." Hayes stood with practiced solemnity, holding a thick folder of manufactured evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, last night's violence was not an isolated incident. Our investigation has revealed a pattern of dangerous behavior, inadequate supervision, and a facility that has become a magnet for troubled individuals who pose a clear threat to our community." The crowd murmured approval as Hayes presented his carefully constructed case. Doctored psychiatric evaluations, false police reports, testimony from concerned citizens who were actually paid actors, a masterpiece of political manipulation designed to destroy any possibility of rational discussion. The Veterans Center has received over $200,000 in city funding over the past 5 years, Hayes continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. Money that could have gone to schools, infrastructure, and genuine public safety initiatives instead of enabling dangerous individuals who refuse to seek proper treatment. Frank struggled to maintain composure as Hayes systematically destroyed his reputation and the center's mission. When his turn came to speak, the hostile crowd barely let him finish a sentence before erupting in jeers and demands that he take responsibility for the staged violence. "The men arrested last night were not members of our center," Frank said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We serve veterans who've sacrificed everything for this country, who deserve support and respect, not persecution based on manufactured lies." "More excuses," someone shouted from the audience. "When will you admit these people are dangerous?" Hayes smiled coldly as he delivered his closing argument. "The evidence is overwhelming. The risk to public safety is immediate and undeniable. I move that the City Council invoke emergency powers to terminate the Veterans Center lease immediately, with demolition to begin Monday morning for the protection of our community." The vote was 4-1, exactly as Hayes had planned. Council member Janet Morrison, no relation to Frank, cast the only dissenting vote, her voice shaking with emotion as she protested the rush to judgment outside the municipal building. After the meeting, Frank sat in his wheelchair staring at the ground while angry citizens filed past, some spitting curses, others simply avoiding eye contact. His life's work had been destroyed in 2 hours of political theater, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chuck helped Frank into the pickup truck, both men silent as they drove through streets that no longer felt like home. In 48 hours, bulldozers would reduce the Veterans Center to rubble, and 200 veterans would lose the sanctuary that had given their lives meaning and purpose. Tyler Jackson waited nervously in the shadows near Chuck's hotel, his face pale with guilt and desperation. Chuck dropped Frank off at his house, where Betty waited on the porch with red-rimmed eyes and a handful of hate mail that had been shoved through their mail slot. Frank wheeled up the ramp without a word, too devastated to discuss the evening's betrayal or comfort his wife's tears. As Chuck drove toward his hotel through the quiet streets, his mind was already working on countermoves, ways to expose Hayes' corruption before Monday morning's demolition. He'd faced impossible odds before, but never against an enemy who controlled the media narrative, the political process, and public opinion. That's when the police cars surrounded him at the traffic light on Main Street. Red and blue lights erupted from every direction, illuminating Chuck's pickup truck like a stage. Uniformed officers emerged with weapons drawn, shouting commands that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Exit the vehicle with your hands visible. Move slowly. Do not make any sudden movements. Chuck complied carefully, understanding immediately that this was Hayes' next move. The charges would be related to the morning's confrontation with Tyler Jackson, twisted by perjured testimony and manufactured evidence into something that justified arrest and imprisonment. Chuck Norris, you're under arrest for assault, disturbing the peace, and terroristic threatening, Sergeant Mills announced, his voice carrying the uncomfortable authority of a man following orders he didn't believe in. You have the right to remain silent. Chuck allowed them to handcuff him without resistance, knowing that any struggle would only provide Hayes with additional ammunition. As they loaded him into the patrol car, he caught sight of Tyler Jackson watching from across the street, his face twisted with guilt and self-loathing. The county jail was a converted building from the 1960s, with small cells and fluorescent lighting that never quite dispelled the institutional gloom. Chuck's cell faced a window that offered a perfect view of the Veterans Center 3 blocks away, where floodlights now illuminated construction equipment that had appeared with suspicious speed. 2 bulldozers, a demolition crane, and a crew of workers who'd obviously been standing by for Hayes' phone call. The machinery sat ready like mechanical vultures, waiting for Monday morning's signal to begin their destructive work. Sheriff Bill Garrett visited Chuck's cell after midnight, his weathered face troubled by doubts he couldn't quite voice. I fought alongside Frank Morrison in Vietnam, he said quietly. Never knew a more honorable man in my life. Then you know this is wrong, Chuck replied, sitting calmly on his narrow bunk. I know a lot of things, Garrett said carefully. But I also know that sworn testimony says you assaulted a young man in broad daylight, threatened him with violence, and created a public disturbance that endangered innocent people. Chuck studied the sheriff's face, reading the conflict between duty and conscience. Interesting how that testimony materialized so quickly after tonight's council meeting. Garrett said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. As he walked away, Chuck heard the sheriff's radio crackle with reports about the Veterans Center. Security guards had been posted around the building, ostensibly to prevent vandalism, but actually to ensure no one could interfere with Monday's demolition. From his cell window, Chuck watched the floodlit construction equipment and knew that Hayes had played his final card perfectly. With Chuck imprisoned and Frank discredited, nothing stood between corruption and its inevitable victory. The clock on the cell wall showed 3:17 a.m. Sunday morning. In 30 hours, the Veterans Center would be rubble, and Hayes would be counting his profits. Sunday morning found Frank Morrison in his garage, staring at his Purple Heart medal with eyes that held no hope left. The automatic garage door was open to the crisp October air, but the workshop that had given him purpose after his accident now felt like a monument to failure. Betty had tried to comfort him through the sleepless night, but how could he explain that he'd failed everyone who'd ever depended on him? 200 veterans would lose their sanctuary tomorrow because he'd been too proud, too broken, too useless to protect them when they needed him most. His service revolver lay on the workbench beside the medal, not because he was contemplating anything desperate, but because he'd been cleaning it obsessively, needing something to do with his hands while his mind churned through scenarios that all ended the same way. Hayes had won. The center would be demolished. The veterans would scatter to the wind, abandoned by a community that had decided they were dangerous rather than heroic. Frank, Betty's voice carried from the kitchen doorway, gentle but concerned. There's someone here to see you. Frank looked up to find Tyler Jackson standing awkwardly in the driveway, his cocky demeanor completely gone. The young fighter carried a black briefcase and wore the haunted expression of a man who'd seen his own soul and found it wanting. I know you don't want to see me, Tyler said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of machinery being tested at the demolition site. But I've got something that might help. Frank's first instinct was to order him away, to tell him his help had come too late and caused too much damage. But something in Tyler's posture, the slumped shoulders, the genuine remorse, reminded Frank of young soldiers he'd counseled through their worst mistakes. Hayes thinks he's won, Tyler continued, setting the briefcase on Frank's workbench. But he's been sloppy, overconfident. He's got recordings, financial documents, communications with the fake witnesses. Everything's in here. Frank opened the briefcase to find dozens of files, computer drives, and audio recordings that Tyler had been systematically copying for weeks. Evidence of bribes, manufactured testimony, communications with organized crime figures, and detailed plans for staging violence at multiple veteran facilities across the region. Why? Frank asked, his voice hoarse from a night of silent grief. Tyler met his eyes for the first time since entering the garage. Because this morning, I watched the news coverage of last night's council meeting. I saw you trying to defend your people, and I realized what I'd really done. I didn't just hurt you. I helped destroy something beautiful that made the world better. Betty appeared beside them, her face showing the first spark of hope Frank had seen in days. Is this enough to stop them? Tyler nodded grimly. It's enough. To send Hayes to federal prison for 20 years. But we need to move fast. The demolition starts at dawn tomorrow, and Hayes has backup plans if anyone tries to interfere. Betty Morrison had spent 45 years being the supportive military wife, the woman behind the hero, content to let Frank lead while she provided quiet strength from the shadows. But as she looked at her broken husband and the young man seeking redemption, something steel-hard crystallized in her blue eyes. Frank Morrison, you listen to me, she said, her voice carrying an authority that made both men straighten instinctively. You did not fail anyone. You were betrayed by corrupt politicians and attacked by professional criminals. There's a difference. She picked up the cordless phone from Frank's workbench and began dialing numbers from memory. Tyler, you're going to help us organize this evidence while I mobilize every military family in this county. Frank watched in amazement as his wife transformed into a general commanding her troops. Within an hour, she'd filled their living room with veteran spouses, adult children, and community members who'd been waiting for someone to give them direction and purpose. Margaret Collins, your daughter Marie, is at the center. Patricia Santos, your son Rick runs the job placement program. We all know what that place means to our families, Betty announced to the gathered crowd. Hayes thinks he can destroy our people because we're old, broken, and forgotten. Time to show him what military families do when you threaten what we love. She assigned tasks with military precision. Janet Wells would prepare an expose for immediate broadcast. Eddie Kowalski would coordinate communication networks, and the veteran spouses would contact every member of the State Veterans Association for emergency support. Tyler found himself in the unexpected role of technical expert, helping transfer his evidence onto multiple drives and preparing sworn testimony that would be legally admissible. His hands shook as he worked, but his voice was steady when he addressed the room. I want everyone to understand something, Tyler said, standing before people whose loved ones he'd targeted for destruction. Hayes isn't just stealing your building. He's part of a network that's been systematically destroying veteran facilities across 6 states. Your fight here is bigger than just saving one center. Martha Peterson, whose husband had died in Vietnam, but whose grandson served in Afghanistan, raised her weathered hand. What do you need from us, son? Public support, media coverage, political pressure. Tyler looked around the room at faces that had hardened with determination. Hayes controls the narrative right now, but if we can get the truth out there, show people what's really happening. Betty was already coordinating with Janet Wells, who'd been investigating irregularities in Hayes' voting record for months. We can interrupt regular programming with a special report at 6 o'clock tonight. Peak viewing time, right when people are making up their minds about tomorrow. Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since his accident: hope. Not the desperate kind that ignores reality, but the solid hope that comes from watching good. People refused to surrender to evil. His community wasn't abandoning him. They were rallying around him, ready to fight alongside rather than behind him. There's something else, Tyler said quietly. Hayes has hired professional security for tomorrow. Not just guards, mercenaries who'll use violence if anyone tries to interfere with the demolition. If we're going to save the center, we need to be prepared for a real fight. Betty Morrison smiled grimly, and for the first time, Frank saw where his own warrior spirit had found its match. Son, you just declared war on a room full of military families. Hayes has no idea what he's up against. Sheriff Bill Garrett approached Chuck Norris's cell at dawn Sunday morning, carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of a man who'd wrestled with his conscience all night and finally chosen the right side. The charges against you were based on perjured testimony, Garrett said without preamble, unlocking the cell door. 3 witnesses have recanted their statements, claiming they were paid to lie by parties unknown. Chuck gathered his belongings calmly, unsurprised by this development. Interesting how witnesses develop sudden attacks of conscience. Tyler Jackson turned over recordings of Hayes coaching them on exactly what to say. Garrett continued as they walked toward the front desk. Kid's been wearing a wire for weeks, apparently. Got enough evidence to put Hayes away for life. The sheriff handed Chuck his personal effects, then pulled him aside as the desk sergeant processed the release paperwork. There's something else you need to know. The FBI has been investigating Hayes for months, tracking his connections to organized crime and municipal corruption across multiple states. Chuck studied Garrett's weathered face, reading between the lines. They've been using our investigation as cover for their own operation. Agent Sarah Mitchell is coordinating with state authorities. They needed Hayes to complete his crimes. Before they could move, needed him to expose his entire network. Garrett's voice was grim. Your arrest bought them the final 24 hours they needed to build an airtight case. Chuck understood the implications immediately. The FBI had been watching Hayes destroy the Veterans Center because they needed evidence of his methods, his connections, his complete criminal enterprise. Justice would eventually be served, but not in time to save Frank's life work. Unless Hayes can be stopped before tomorrow morning's demolition, Chuck said. Garrett nodded grimly. The demolition crews are professionals, hired through legitimate channels. They have legal authorization from the city council and no knowledge of the corruption behind it. Even if we expose Hayes tonight, the bulldozers will still show up at dawn. Chuck accepted his truck keys and headed for the door, his mind already calculating distances and timing. The Veterans Center was 3 blocks away, surrounded by Hayes' security contractors and construction equipment that would begin its destructive work in less than 12 hours. He found Frank and Tyler waiting in the parking lot. Frank's been equipped with communication equipment that would have impressed a military command center. Tyler looked exhausted but determined, while Frank radiated the focused intensity Chuck remembered from their first meeting. FBI wants to arrest Hayes after the demolition, Frank reported without preamble. They'll get their corruption convictions, but the center will still be rubble. Not if we can hold them off until the federal warrants are served, Chuck replied, studying Tyler's evidence files. How much time do we need? Tyler checked his phone for messages from Agent Mitchell. 12 hours minimum. The federal task force is coordinating raids in 6 states simultaneously, but they can't move until all the targets are in position. Chuck looked toward the Veterans Center, where floodlights illuminated construction equipment positioned like weapons of war. Hayes' security contractors patrolled the perimeter with military precision, ready to ensure nothing interfered with tomorrow's demolition. Then we hold the line for 12 hours, Chuck said simply. Frank, how many veterans can you rally? Frank's smile was grim but determined. Every veteran in the county, plus their families and anyone else who believes in fighting for what's right. Hayes wanted a war. He's about to get one. As evening shadows stretched across the Veterans Center parking lot, Frank Morrison's tactical planning came alive with the precision of a military operation. Veterans had been quietly gathering all afternoon, not just the center's regular members, but men and women from across the county who'd answered the call to defend their sanctuary. Chuck watched with professional admiration as Frank coordinated defensive positions from his wheelchair, his special forces training evident in every decision. Tommy Burke and his wheelchair-bound squad controlled the main entrance, their mobility equipment converted into surprisingly effective barriers. Rick Santos led the one-armed veterans in securing the building's multiple exits, while Blind Marie Collins coordinated communications from the command center using enhanced hearing that rivaled military-grade detection equipment. Hayes' security contractors are professionals, Chuck observed, studying the enemy positions through binoculars. Ex-military, probably mercenaries with combat experience. They're not going to be intimidated by a show of force. Frank nodded. Grimly, his brown eyes focused on the tactical display he'd created on a whiteboard. Doesn't matter. We're not trying to win a battle. We're trying to buy time until the FBI can move. 12 hours of defensive action, nothing more. Tyler Jackson had transformed completely over the past 24 hours, his arrogance replaced by genuine respect for the veterans he'd once targeted. He now served as liaison between Frank's defenders and Agent Mitchell's federal task force. coordinating timing and providing real-time intelligence about Hayes' plans. Security sweep shows 15 contractors with Hayes, Tyler reported, monitoring communications through equipment Betty had somehow acquired from sources she refused to identify. They're armed and equipped for serious resistance, expecting to clear the building by force if necessary. Chuck studied the building's layout, noting sight lines and defensive advantages. The converted warehouse had solid construction and limited access points, but it was also exposed to attack from multiple directions. Hayes' men could surround the building and wait them out, or escalate to actual violence if they chose. "There's something else," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of difficult decisions. "Hayes' backup plan involves more than just demolishing our building. Tyler's evidence shows communications about staged incidents at veteran facilities in 6 other states. If we fail here, dozens of other centers face the same destruction." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about saving one building in one small town. It was about protecting an entire network of veteran support systems from systematic destruction by organized crime disguised as political reform. As darkness fell, Chuck conducted final defensive preparations while Frank maintained communication with federal authorities. The Veterans Center had become a fortress, defended by men and women who'd already proven their willingness to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. 9:30 p.m. Hayes' black Mercedes pulled into the parking lot, followed by 2 SUVs full of armed contractors. Roger Hayes emerged from his car with the confident swagger of a man who believed victory was inevitable, surveying the Veterans Center like a general inspecting conquered territory. Chuck recognized the lead contractor immediately, Deke Morrison, a mercenary he'd encountered years ago during less publicized conflicts. Morrison was competent, ruthless, and completely without moral constraints. If Hayes had hired him, the situation was about to become genuinely dangerous. Hayes raised a bullhorn and addressed the Veterans Center directly. "You have 1 hour to evacuate the building voluntarily. After that, we'll remove you by whatever means necessary. This is your only warning." Frank Morrison wheeled himself to the center's front window, visible to Hayes and his mercenaries, and raised his own voice in response. "This is our home, Hayes. If you want it, come and take it." Hayes' 1-hour ultimatum ticked down to 0 at exactly 10:30 p.m., and Deke Morrison's mercenaries moved with military precision. They approached the Veterans Center from multiple angles, using professional tactics designed to overwhelm defenders. Through coordinated assault, Chuck Norris stood in the main lobby, calm as deep water, while Frank Morrison coordinated defensive positions from the command center. The building's converted warehouse design created natural choke points that favored defenders, but Morrison's men had superior numbers and modern equipment. The first breach attempt came through the loading dock, where 3 mercenaries tried to force entry with tactical explosives. Tommy Burke met them in his wheelchair, using his mobility and upper body strength to create chaos in the narrow doorway. His wheelchair became a battering ram, striking with precision that sent 2 attackers sprawling. "East entrance." Frank's voice crackled through their improvised communication system. "Rick, take your team and reinforce." Rick Santos led 4 one-armed veterans in a flanking maneuver that caught Morrison's men completely off guard. The mercenaries had prepared for broken-down old soldiers, not tactically trained warriors who'd adapted their fighting techniques to their disabilities. Chuck faced the main assault at the front entrance, where Morrison himself led 5 men in. A direct attack designed to overwhelm through superior firepower. But Morrison had forgotten something crucial about legends. They became legends for a reason. Chuck moved like water flowing around rocks, redirecting the attacker's aggression into controlled falls and submission holds. His techniques were economical, precise, designed to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. One mercenary charged with a tactical baton. Chuck redirected his momentum into a wall. Another tried to tackle him. Chuck used the man's own weight to send him crashing into his companions. Marie Collins provided tactical oversight from the communications center, her enhanced hearing tracking enemy movements through the building structure. "Chuck, 3 more. Coming up the fire escape on your left." Frank's strategic mind orchestrated the defense like a symphony of controlled violence. Each veteran fought according to their abilities. Wheelchair-bound defenders created mobile barriers, One-armed fighters used their prosthetics as weapons, and the blind veterans provided early warning systems that rivaled military-grade detection equipment. But Morrison's mercenaries were professionals, and they adapted quickly to the unexpected resistance. They regrouped, called for backup, and prepared to escalate their tactics beyond non-lethal force. Frank, Tyler's voice carried urgent warning from his monitoring station. Morrison's calling Hayes for permission to use live ammunition. They're done playing games. Through the front windows, Chuck could see Hayes standing beside his Mercedes, phone pressed to his ear, his face twisted with rage at the unexpected resistance. The corrupt councilman had expected easy victory over broken veterans, not a coordinated defense that was making his mercenaries look incompetent. Hayes gave Morrison a sharp nod, and the mercenaries began checking their weapons with deadly intent. Hayes raised his bullhorn again, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed. This is your final warning. Evacuate immediately or face the consequences. I have full legal authority to clear this building by any means necessary. The Veteran Center's defenders maintained their positions, but Chuck could feel the tension ratcheting up as Morrison's mercenaries prepared for lethal escalation. Through his earpiece, Tyler provided updates from Agent Mitchell's federal task force, still 4 hours away from completing their coordinated raids. That's when the unexpected happened. Janet Wells' voice suddenly filled the night air, broadcast from speakers that Betty Morrison had somehow positioned around the Veterans Center. The reporter's professional tone cut through the darkness like a blade through silk. This is Janet Wells with Channel 7 News, broadcasting live from the Riverside Veterans Center, where corrupt City Councilman Roger Hayes is attempting to destroy a facility that serves over 200 veterans and their families. Hayes spun toward the news van that had appeared at the edge of the parking lot, his face pale with sudden understanding. The live broadcast was being beamed to television stations across the state, exposing his corruption scheme to thousands of viewers. Hayes has been systematically destroying veteran facilities across 6 states, Janet continued, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. We have recordings of him bribing witnesses, staging fake incidents, and coordinating with organized crime figures to steal public property worth millions of dollars. Chuck watched Hayes panic as his carefully constructed narrative collapsed in real time. The corrupt politician grabbed his phone, frantically calling contacts who could kill the broadcast. But Betty Morrison's community network had outmaneuvered his political machine. Morrison's mercenaries began backing toward their vehicles as squad cars appeared at both ends of the street. Not local police under Hayes' influence, but state troopers and federal agents who'd been coordinating with Agent Mitchell's task force. Roger Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and violation of federal racketeering statutes, Agent Mitchell announced through her own bullhorn as FBI vehicles surrounded the parking lot. Deke Morrison and associates, drop your weapons and assume surrender positions. The mercenaries complied immediately, recognizing federal authority and superior numbers. Professional criminals understood when a situation had shifted beyond salvage, and Morrison was too experienced to fight a battle he couldn't win. Hayes made one desperate attempt to flee, running toward his Mercedes while screaming about his political connections and legal immunity. Chuck Norris stepped into his path with casual ease, and Hayes found himself face to face with the legend who'd started his downfall. Going somewhere, Councilman? Chuck asked politely. Hayes swung wildly, his soft politician's punch meeting empty air as Chuck sidestepped effortlessly. A gentle redirect sent Hayes stumbling into the waiting arms of 2 FBI agents, who cuffed him while reading his rights to the live television audience. Frank Morrison emerged from the Veterans Center in his wheelchair, surrounded by the defenders, who'd stood with him through the darkest hour. His face showed exhaustion, but also something that had been missing for months: pride in what they'd accomplished together. Tyler Jackson approached Hayes as the agents loaded him into their vehicle. Just so you know, Tyler said quietly, every veteran in this building is worth 10 of you. 1 week later, Tyler Jackson stood at a podium in the main hall of the Riverside Veterans Center, facing a packed room of veterans, their families, community members, and reporters from across the region. The young fighter's transformation from arrogant bully to repentant ally had captured national attention, but his focus remained entirely on the people he'd wronged. My name is Tyler Jackson, he began, his voice steady despite the enormous weight of public confession. 7 days ago, I was paid $50,000 to humiliate and destroy the reputation of Frank Morrison and the veterans this center serves. The room was completely silent as Tyler detailed his role in Hayes' corruption scheme, holding nothing back about his own greed, arrogance, and willingness to profit from the suffering of better people. He spoke without excuses, accepting full responsibility for actions that had nearly destroyed an entire community. "I cannot undo the pain I've caused," Tyler continued, his eyes finding Frank Morrison in the front row. "But I can ensure it never happens again. Today I'm donating my entire fight purse from last month's championship, $200,000, to expand the Veterans Center's programs and ensure they have resources to fight future attacks." Frank nodded slightly, his expression showing forgiveness that Tyler was still learning to accept from himself. Betty Morrison dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Eddie Kowalski grinned broadly from the back of the room. But Tyler wasn't finished. "More importantly, I'm committing to train here 3 days a week, learning real martial arts philosophy from the greatest teacher I've ever met." He gestured toward Chuck Norris, who sat quietly in a corner chair. "Chuck Norris didn't just defeat me physically, he showed me what true strength looks like." The applause was thunderous, but Chuck remained characteristically humble, deflecting attention back to the veterans who'd fought to save their sanctuary. Over the past week, the center had received donations from across the country, along with volunteers offering everything from construction services to legal assistance. The city council had issued formal apologies and voted unanimously to grant the Veterans Center permanent protected status, ensuring no future political administration could threaten its existence. Federal funding had arrived to expand programs and hire additional counselors, while the State Veterans Association had designated Riverside as a model facility for other communities. Frank Morrison had been offered the position of executive director, his leadership during the crisis proving he'd found his post-accident mission. The depression that had plagued him for months had been replaced by renewed purpose and the respect of everyone who'd witnessed his transformation from broken victim to inspiring leader. Tyler concluded his remarks by addressing the veterans directly. "You taught me that honor isn't about winning fights. It's about fighting for something bigger than yourself. Thank you for showing me what heroes actually look like." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Chuck found himself surrounded by veterans wanting to shake his hand and thank him for his intervention. He accepted their gratitude graciously but kept glancing toward the parking lot, where his truck waited with maps marking his next destination. Some legends were meant to stay in one place, becoming pillars of their communities. Others were meant to wander, carrying hope to wherever it was needed most. 3 months later, Chuck Norris returned to the Riverside Veterans Center for its official rededication ceremony, finding the facility transformed beyond recognition. The original warehouse had been expanded with new wings housing additional counseling offices, computer labs, and workshop spaces where veterans created furniture and crafts sold throughout the region. Over 400 people crowded the sunny parking lot for the celebration, including veterans from 6 states whose own facilities had been saved by the evidence Tyler had provided. The corruption network that Hayes had belonged to was now completely dismantled, with dozens of arrests and millions of dollars in stolen property returned to veteran programs. Frank Morrison presided over the ceremony from his wheelchair, but his role had evolved far beyond facility management. He'd become a nationally recognized advocate for veteran rights, testifying before Congress and consulting with communities establishing their own support centers. His depression had been replaced by fierce purpose and the deep satisfaction of meaningful work. Betty Morrison beamed with pride as she watched her husband address the crowd, finally seeing him embrace the hero she'd always known him to be. The worry lines around her eyes had been replaced by laugh lines, and her own leadership of the Veteran Family Support Network had made her a local celebrity in her own right. Tyler Jackson stood near the back of the crowd, wearing the simple work clothes of someone who'd traded flashy celebrity for genuine contribution. His training at the center had transformed not just his fighting technique, but his entire philosophy, and his social media presence now promoted veteran causes instead of personal aggrandizement. Chuck listened as Frank spoke about the power of community, the importance of standing together against corruption, and the obligation every generation had to protect those who'd served their country. The speech was eloquent, heartfelt, and delivered with the authority of someone who'd proven his words through action. The real victory here wasn't defeating Hayes or saving this building, Frank concluded, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. It was remembering that we're strongest when we stand together, when we refuse to let evil triumph, through our silence or inaction. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began mingling around food tables Eddie had catered, Chuck made his quiet farewells. He found Frank near the memorial wall where names of local veterans were inscribed in granite, including several who died since the center opened. "Thank you," Frank said simply, extending his hand to the man who'd changed everything. Chuck shook Frank's hand firmly, noting the strength and confidence that had returned to the veteran's grip. "You saved yourself, Frank. I just helped you remember who you were underneath the pain. Where will you go next?" Chuck smiled, glancing toward his truck where new maps waited with routes to communities that might need what he could offer. Wherever someone needs to be reminded that heroes don't retire, they just find new missions. As the celebration continued around them, Chuck Norris walked quietly to his truck and drove toward the horizon, leaving behind a stronger community and carrying forward the eternal promise that some legends never fade. They simply move on to the next town where justice needs a champion. In his rearview mirror, the Veterans Center stood proud against the afternoon sky, no longer a symbol of what could be lost, but a testament to what could be saved when good people refuse to surrender to evil. If you liked the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.